The first thing Alara felt was the scratchy wool of her favorite blue sweater. The second thing she felt was terror. She gasped, clutching her chest, expecting to feel the jagged edge of the scavenger's blade that had ended her life in the first timeline. Instead, she felt her heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, and warm. She wasn't in the ruins of Seattle. She was in her bedroom. The date on her phone read, October 14th. 3 days before the glass rain virus and the subsequent collapse. Alara stood before the mirror. 16 years old, bright blonde hair and blue eyes that looked far too tired for a teenager. In her first life, those eyes had been filled with naivety. Not anymore. She reached out and touched the air, and a shimmering violet ripple appeared in the space before her. The void garden. It was a pocket dimension, a gift from her rebirth. It was a silent, sunless expanse of roughly 3 acres where time stood still. Anything she put in there would stay exactly as it was. Hot coffee stayed steaming, ice stayed frozen. This time, she whispered to her reflection, I don't play the victim. Alara didn't waste a second. She sold her mother's jewelry, her father's old truck, and emptied her college fund. She spent 72 hours in a fever dream of logistics. The basics: 5,000 pounds of rice, 2,000 cans of protein, and 500 gallons of fuel. The comforts: chocolate, clean socks, and a mountain of books. The essentials: medical-grade antibiotics, solar panels, and a compound bow. By the morning of the third day, her void garden was a chaotic warehouse of survival. When the sirens finally began to wail across the city, Alara was already in a rugged SUV she'd borrowed from a dealership, driving toward the outskirts. 2 weeks into the collapse, the world was a gray smear of smoke and desperation. Alara was passing through a small town in Oregon when she stopped at a ransacked pharmacy to look for specific pediatric vitamins, items she'd forgotten in her initial rush. She found them, but she also found Toby. He was 10 years old, huddled behind a counter of shattered glass. His face was streaked with soot, and he was clutching a plastic toy dinosaur like it was a holy relic. They went to get the medicine, Toby whispered, his voice cracking. Mom and Dad, they told me to hide in the cabinet. They said they'd be right back. Alara looked toward the back exit. Through the cracked door, she saw 2 figures slumped in the alleyway, surrounded by the feral, the victims of the glass rain who had lost their minds to the fever. They weren't coming back. Alara's internal, first life, voice told her to run. Extra weight is a death sentence, it whispered. But then she saw the boy's eyes, blue like hers, but filled with a terrifyingly familiar hollow look. They're gone, Toby, she said, her voice surprisingly soft. But I'm here, and I have a very big backpack. Toby didn't trust her at first. Not until the third night, when they were camped in a freezing hunting cabin. Toby was shivering, his lips turning blue. Alara checked the perimeter, then turned to him. Can you keep a secret? She reached into the air. Her arm seemed to vanish into a shimmering fold of light. A second later, she pulled out a steaming bowl of beef stew and a thick, self-heating thermal blanket. Toby's jaw dropped. Are you a wizard? Something like that, Alara smiled, the first genuine smile in 2 lifetimes. In this space, things don't go bad. I have enough food for 100 years, Toby. But you can't tell anyone. If people know, they won't just want the food. They'll want me. As the months passed, the duo became a well-oiled machine. Alara taught Toby how to move silently and how to use a slingshot. In return, Toby kept her human. He reminded her to look at the stars. He reminded her that they weren't just surviving, they were living. But the world was getting crueler. A militia known as the Harvesters had taken over the valley. They tracked the tire marks of Alara's SUV to their mountain hideout. One evening, the cabin was surrounded. 20 men, armed with scrap metal armor and rusted rifles. We know you've got supplies, girly, the leader yelled. No one stays that healthy-looking in the great frost without a horde. The inventory of defense. Alara closed her eyes and accessed the void garden. She didn't just have food. She had prepared for this. Item. Quantity. Purpose. High lumen flashbangs. 4. To disorient the perimeter. Spiked caltrops. 200. To disable their vehicles. Compound bow. 1. Silent elimination. Smoke grenades. 6. Cover for the escape. Toby, get on the secret floorboard, Alara commanded. But Alara, do it. I'm not losing another family. The battle wasn't a firefight. It was a haunting. Alara used her space to vanish and reappear. She would step into the void garden, move 20 feet in the real world, and step back out behind a tree. To the harvesters, she was a ghost. An arrow would fly from the darkness, and by the time they turned, she was gone. One by one, they broke. They were superstitious men, and they believed the mountain was haunted by a vengeful spirit. When the last of them fled into the night, Alara returned to the cabin. She was shaking, her blonde hair matted with snow and sweat. Toby crawled out from the floorboards and didn't say a word. He just hugged her waist. For the first time, the void in Alara's heart felt a little less empty. By the 1-year anniversary of the collapse, the world had settled into a new, brutal equilibrium. Alara and Toby had moved further north, into the deep pine forests where the feral couldn't survive the cold. They sat on a ridge overlooking a valley. Alara pulled out 2 fresh apples, crisp and red, as if they had just been picked from an orchard that no longer existed. "Where do we go now?" Toby asked, crunching into the fruit. Alara looked at her wrist, where the violet mark of the void garden glowed faintly. She thought about the thousands of seeds she had stored, the tools, the books, and the sheer potential locked away in her pocket dimension. "We find others," Alara said. "Not the harvesters, not the ones who steal. We find the ones who want to build something. I have the foundation in my pocket, Toby. We just need to find the architects." The girl with the blonde hair and the boy with the toy dinosaur stood up. They weren't just 2 orphans in the apocalypse anymore. They were the keepers of the old world, waiting for the right moment to plant the seeds of the new one. It had been 14 months since the world ended. Alara sat in the passenger seat of their armored SUV, now reinforced with scrap metal and solar-tinted glass, while Toby practiced his inventory management. In the back, Toby was closing his eyes, trying to sense the void garden. He couldn't go inside it yet, but Alara had discovered that if she held his hand, he could see the shelves. "I see the peaches," Toby whispered, his brow furrowed, "and the box with the boom stickers." "Good," Alara said, her blue eyes scanning the tree line. "Keep focused. One day you'll need to pull things out if I can't." Suddenly, the radio, a high-frequency rig Alara had saved from a military base, crackled to life. It wasn't the usual white noise of the apocalypse. It was a rhythmic, repeating sequence. "Latitude 45.5, Sector 7, the library is open. Repeat, the library is open." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. In her first life, she'd heard rumors of the library. It was said to be a vault built into a mountain, run by scientists and teachers who had predicted the collapse. They didn't want soldiers, they wanted knowledge. "Toby," she said, shifting the gear into drive, "we're going to school." To get to the coordinates, they had to cross the Columbia River. Most bridges had been blown by the military to contain the initial outbreak, but the Iron Bridge was rumored to be held by a group called the Tollmen. When they arrived, the bridge was a fortress of shipping containers. A woman with a scarred face and a heavy rifle stepped out. "No one crosses for free, Blondie. We don't want your paper money. We want fuel or flesh." Alara didn't flinch. She stepped out of the car, looking every bit the 16-year-old girl, but with the posture of a veteran. She reached behind her back, seemingly into her waistband, but actually into the void. The negotiation assets. Item offered. Quantity. Why it's valuable. Iodine tablets. 5 bottles. Prevents radiation sickness in the gray zones. Freeze-dried coffee. 10-gallon bags. A luxury that keeps guards awake. Antibiotic ointment. 20 tubes. Essential for preventing infection from feral scratches. The woman's eyes widened as Alara produced the items out of thin air. "You're a carrier," the woman hissed, her voice a mix of awe and greed. "We heard about people like you, mutations from the glass rain." "I'm a survivor," Alara corrected. "And if you try to take more than what I'm offering, you'll find out that I also carry a lot of C4. She reached back into the void and pulled out a detonator. It was a bluff, mostly. But in this world, a blonde girl with a detonator was a girl you didn't mess with. They let the SUV pass. As they drove through the desolate remains of a coastal city, Alara saw something that made her slam on the brakes. It was a house, a white suburban home with a red door, now partially collapsed. "Alara," Toby asked, sensing her shift in mood. "This was my house," she whispered. "In the first life, I died right there on that sidewalk." She walked toward the spot. The memories flooded back, the heat of the sun, the sound of screaming, and the cold steel of the blade. She stood over the very patch of earth where her life had ended once before. She reached into the void garden and pulled out a single white lily, preserved in a vase of water from a florist she'd raided a year ago. She placed it on the cracked pavement. "You're different now," Toby said, standing beside her. He took her hand. "You're not that girl anymore." "No," Alara said, her voice strengthening. "That girl didn't have a brother to protect." The coordinates led them deep into the Cascades. They found a massive steel door embedded in the side of a granite cliff. No guards, no spikes, just a camera lens and a speaker. "State your purpose," a voice crackled. "I have 17,000 books in digital and physical format," Alara said, her voice clear. "I have 3 years' worth of non-perishable medical supplies, and I have a 10-year-old boy who needs an education." The camera panned down to Toby. He held up his toy dinosaur. "And the boy," the voice asked, "what does he bring?" Toby looked at the camera. "I'm the one who remembers the stars," he said firmly. "Alara says that's important." There was a long silence. Then, with a groan of heavy hydraulics, the mountain began to open. A warm, yellow light spilled out onto the snow, a light that didn't look like a fire or a flare. It looked like home. Inside, the library was a marvel. Hydroponic gardens lined the walls, and children were actually playing in a courtyard. But as Alara was greeted by the head librarian, a man named Dr. Eris, she realized the catch. "Your gift, Alara," the void space, Eris said, walking her through the corridors. "We've seen others like you. It's a side effect of the virus's interaction with specific blood types, but it's not permanent." Alara froze. "What do you mean?" "The space is a pocket of energy. Eventually, it collapses. Everything inside is either expelled at once or lost forever. Based on our calculations, you have about 6 months left before the garden closes." Alara looked back at Toby, who was looking at a shelf of real, paper books with wide-eyed wonder. She had 6 months to unload a lifetime of supplies. 6 months to transition from a carrier back to just a girl. She looked at her hands, the violet glow already beginning to flicker like a dying candle. "Then we better get to work," she said. The transition was far from easy. For over a year, Alara's space had been her armor and her identity. To the world, she was a miracle. To herself, she was a warehouse. Now, as the violet glow on her wrist grew dim and pulsed like a failing heartbeat, she had to face the reality of becoming just Alara again. The library wasn't just a bunker. It was an experimental colony. But they were starving. Their hydroponics weren't yet at scale, and the surrounding dead zones were picked clean. Dr. Eris organized the emptying. Every morning, Alara stood in the central atrium, her hand extended into the air. "It feels like pulling silk out of a wound," she told Toby. "The more I take out, the more it resists." She began strategically unloading. It wasn't just food. It was the tools of civilization. Medical grade, 400 pounds of surgical steel, sterilization kits, and the remaining 3,000 doses of amoxicillin. Agricultural, heirloom seeds she'd hoarded from 3 different states: corn, soy, kale, and medicinal herbs. The heavy metal, a literal tractor she had disassembled and stored in pieces during her 3-day sprint before the world ended. The diminishing return. Month. Void stability. Side effects. Month 1. 80%. Mild headaches after retrieving large items. Month 3. 45%. Items occasionally come out cold or slightly distorted. Month 5. 10%. The violet mark is nearly gray. Retrieving items requires physical effort. While Alara fed the colony, Toby was being forged. The library didn't need just soldiers. They needed people who could read the land and the history books simultaneously. Toby, now 11, had grown 3 inches. His blue eyes were no longer wide with fear. They were sharp with calculation. He was the star pupil of the Scholar Scout program, a curriculum designed by Alara and Dr. Eris. Toby's training modules. Stealth botany, identifying which mutated plants were poisonous and which could be used as natural camouflage. Topography of the Old World, memorizing the 20th century sewer and subway maps to navigate ruined cities. The silent language, a hand signal system Alara developed from her first life to communicate without alerting the ferals. One afternoon, Alara watched him from the balcony as he navigated a training course in total silence. He didn't use a gun. He used a specialized crossbow Alara had pulled from her space months ago. "He's going to be better than me," Alara whispered to Dr. Eris. "He has to be," Eris replied. "You are the bridge to the past, Alara. He is the path to the future." In the 5th month, the disaster they feared finally struck. The glass rain virus had mutated again, creating screamers, ferals with vocal cords so warped they could emit a high-frequency pitch that shattered glass and disoriented humans. A pack of screamers found a ventilation intake on the mountain's north face. They didn't just attack, they paralyzed the guards with their cry. Alara was in the infirmary, her hand deep in the void, trying to pull out the very last of the backup oxygen tanks. The violet mark on her wrist was flickering violently. "Alara, they're in the sea wing," Toby's voice crackled over her radio. She felt the space buck. It was like a door slamming on her arm. She pulled back, and instead of an oxygen tank, she pulled out a handful of dust. The void was collapsing early. Alara ran toward the sea wing, her blonde hair flying behind her. She found Toby trapped behind a fallen support beam, a screamer perched atop a pile of crates, its jaw unhinging to let out a killing blast. "Toby, eyes shut," she screamed. She reached into the air one last time. She didn't look for food. She didn't look for medicine. She reached for the very back of the void garden, the place where she had stored the emergency scuttling charge she'd kept since the first life. The space screamed. The violet light flared so brightly it blinded the screamer. With a roar of effort, Alara pulled out a high-intensity sonic dampener. She slammed it onto the floor and activated it. The device emitted an anti-noise that canceled out the screamer's pitch. The creature fell, clutching its ears in agony. Toby didn't hesitate. He rolled from under the beam, pulled his crossbow, and fired a single, bolt-perfect shot. Silence returned to the library. The breach was sealed, and the screamers were driven out. Alara sat on the floor, breathing hard. She looked down at her wrist. The violet mark was gone. There was only a faint, silver scar where the portal had once opened. She reached into the air. Nothing happened. The void garden was closed. The 3-day sprint, the stored riches, the magic that had defined her rebirth, it was all gone. Toby walked over to her, his face covered in soot but his hands steady. He reached into his own pocket, a real, physical pocket, and pulled out a small, slightly bruised apple. "I found this in the hydroponic lab this morning," he said, handing it to her. "I was saving it for you." Alara took the apple. It wasn't a perfect fruit from her void garden. It was cold, it had a blemish, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The story of the reborn girl ended that day. A new story began. Alara, now 17, stood at the gates of the library. She didn't have a magical space anymore. She had a backpack, a sturdy pair of boots, and a map sheet. Toby stood beside her, his scout gear rattling slightly in the wind. "Where to today, Scout?" she asked. Toby looked out over the valley, his blue eyes scanning the horizon for the subtle signs of life he had been trained to see. He pointed toward a distant smoke plume, not the black smoke of a fire, but the white, steady smoke of a hearth. "Survivors," Toby said confidently. 2 miles east, through the pine grove past the old highway. Elara smiled. She was no longer the girl who knew the future because she had lived it. She was the girl who was building a future because she chose to. "Lead the way," she said. And together, they stepped out into the world, not as a warehouse and her ward, but as 2 pioneers in a world that was finally, slowly, beginning to bloom again. The end. The greatest supply she ever brought back from the first life wasn't the food or the fuel. It was the knowledge that some things are worth more the second time around.
A new beginning, a haunting past. We survived at last. We are safe, we are restored. I was reborn to reform the life I lost in the past. A new beginning, we are a family, and I am whole once more. The world I live in now I am fulfilled. Oh, the void is no more. A new beginning, we are a family. The void is no